Well, hey guys, thanks for tuning in to this week's sermon Q&A on the sermon on Jesus and divorce. Stephen, it has been a while since we've done a sermon Q&A here, and so I was so prepared for the floodgates to open with questions. And so before we tell them, because you know how many questions we got, listener, how many questions do you think we got? Just go ahead and picture that number in your mind's eye right now. Okay, they probably got it now, right?
I think so.
Okay, would it surprise you to know that the number is 1? We got 1 grand total question. So, you know how I said on Sunday, like, hey, I could preach or I could answer all your questions, but you don't want to be here that long? Apparently, I did make people stay that long. So, lesson learned for me. I guess I could save more for the podcast. But here's what we'll do. Let's go through this question because I think it's a really good one. And if you tuned in, you're like, there's only one question. Stick around. This is worth hearing. And then at the end, I'm going to put to you, would you pull any other questions out? And you might say, no, you preached too long. All the questions are already answered. But let's do this and see where the time takes us. All right, here is the question. The question is it biblical to have an elder on the board who has been divorced? Stephen, before we get into it, let me just first say, when I got this question, I was delighted to get it, and here's why. We are moving towards a process of reestablishing a plurality of elders here. So I just want to say, question asker, thank you for sending this in, because what this says to me is that someone or a group of someones, and then typed it in, is thinking seriously about the process. We said the congregation is going to be involved in bringing elders on. And so what this says to me is someone or someones are thinking, hey, we're going to be bringing elders on. I want to make sure I'm understanding this in the most biblical way, which I think is super cool. So I guess I just want to celebrate that before we dive in. That said, Stephen, how would you begin to answer this question?
Yeah, I would begin by really looking at the text. I think what it's pointing at, instead of Matthew chapter 5, which is where we were in our sermon text, which is about divorce, and there are many other passages throughout the Bible that deal with it. The question about elders, I think, is primarily answered in 1 Timothy 3. And so in 1 Timothy 3, we see the qualifications for overseers. The scholars will often tell us that the idea of an overseer and the idea of an elder should be mapped on top of each other. And so we'll say for an overseer, they give us a list of qualifications. And in verse 2, it reads, therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife. And then it goes on to say they need to be sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, all this whole list of things. And so some people will say, because that is such an ambiguous phrase, that
the husband of one wife.
Yeah, the husband of one wife is such an ambiguous phrase. It can go a lot of ways. It could be like, oh, your spouse has never died. Oh, you've never been divorced. Oh, you only married one woman. It really is pushing on. There's a variety of ways that could be interpreted.
Okay, so can I just say at this point, we want to celebrate the question askers taking seriously our life as a church. Also, question asker, you're obviously thinking biblically, which is, again, these are 2 wins we just want to celebrate along the way. From what you just shared, does it oversimplify it to say this phrase, a one-woman, husband of one wife? And I should just say, we've talked about this in elder training. That phrase, husband of one wife, is in the original language literally a one-woman man. Is it fair to say kind of 2 major ways to interpret that would be, way number 1 is it's literally speaking to numerically, that you've only ever been married to one woman. And then the other way to interpret that would be more, it's getting at a heart posture that you only have eyes for your girl. Like your heart is totally devoted to her. And so it's not so much saying, have you been married before? It's talking about the present state of your marriage now. Is that kind of fair to say 2 camps? It's literally the number, or no, it's talking about a heart posture when it says that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, especially in our culture, tend to go towards that. It's a number. It says one woman man. But I think if you look at all the surrounding language, it seems to really be pushing towards that heart posture idea, I would say, because if it says, this is a noble task, and therefore you need to be above reproach, and the husband of one wife, and sober-minded, it seems to be pushing at the character of the person who is being considered to be an overseer or an elder. And I think what he's doing is he's talking about the type of character a person has, because your actions reveal to the world the type of person you are. As you marry one woman and stay faithful to that one woman, you are demonstrating a character trait by that faithful expression of what marriage is. I don't think getting caught up like, well, technically their spouse died, so they are no longer qualified because they're not married to one woman anymore. It's like, I don't think that. I think you can be a faithful, loving person who is committed to caring for and shepherding, or to use I think the words of Solomon in the Song of Solomon, like helping her, tending her so she's a well-watered vine. This idea where, that's the type of person they are, is what it's looking at, rather than specifically, well, let's count, because
Sure. Yep. Here's what I appreciate about what you just said. Like, if for a while, you read this just at face value, the husband of one wife, to me, it kind of sounds like you're just saying you've only ever been married once. I think it was doing deeper reflection on this passage. And again, like, I think learning the biblical languages, learning that what it literally says is a one-woman man, made me slow down and think about what's here in English. So I'm not saying you have to have the secret of knowing the biblical languages. I think it just slows you down and say, oh, I've been assuming what this means. Let me think well about what this means. And just to read this in English, here's something that came up when you were speaking that I've never thought of this before. Keep reading the list. Sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard. These seem to be talking about overall dispositions of a man. So, like, are you not a drunkard if you got drunk once in college? Does that make you now a drunkard? Like, no, we would all say no. Being not a drunkard is, are you known for the kind of person that you're often like, you can't trust that person. They're drunk. Give me your keys, Or are you known as the type of person that's more sober-minded? And so I think the context here does incline us to read that in such a way that sees it more of a heart posture, which, when we did elder training, this is how I taught it to our guys, is the question here is not, have you been married before? Though I think we should ask some serious questions about that. I'll address that in a minute. The primary question being addressed here is, how devoted is your heart to your wife? And if that sounds squishy, or like we're not being strong enough, here, let me say something controversial that I believe with all my heart. I actually think to interpret the husband of one wife as speaking of a heart posture, not a number, actually raises the bar of what Paul is asking for elders here. Here's what I mean by that. If you interpret this to say husband of one wife means you've never been divorced, that would allow someone who's in the type of marriage I talked about on Sunday, where you've never filed paperwork, but you're living in separate bedrooms, you have separate bank accounts, there's no emotional intimacy, there's no real vitality to the marriage, that would allow someone technically to be qualified. If what we're saying here, though, is your heart is totally devoted to your wife, that person would not be qualified because their heart isn't devoted to their wife. And so I actually think we're raising the bar to say, hey, it's not enough that you haven't been divorced in your past. We're looking for someone who has the type of marriage that someone could look at and see something of Christ's love for us. Is it imperfect? Of course it is. But I think it's raising the bar to say, how devoted is your heart to your wife? And do you have eyes for her alone? Or are you caught up in lust like we talked about the previous week, and your eyes are out there for everybody else? And think about how much grief we would save ourselves if we took this qualification seriously. Just the number of pastors that fall from ministry and bring grief. It's like if we really tested not just the number of wives, but the health of the marriage and the vitality of a man's heart for his bride, I think we could save ourselves a lot of pain. So that's why I would interpret it that way. I think it's the most faithful interpretation of those words in the overall context. And I think it makes better sense of the ministry of Jesus and Paul to interpret this. So, okay, let's give a clear answer, because we're on the same page on that, right? Yeah. To give a clear answer, I would say no, it's not disqualifying for eldership to have a divorce. Or I should say this, it's not automatically disqualifying. Because I read this as a heart posture statement. Now that said, if someone has been divorced, it's not like that doesn't matter. I think I would just have a series of follow-up questions in that case. So I want to know, how long ago was the divorce? Was this before your conversion, or was this after becoming a Christian? Tell me the circumstances of it. Some of the questions would be, does it fall under kind of the exceptions Jesus gives, or is it way out there? And I'm not saying there's a single answer that would just end the discussion, but I think I want to learn more. And what I'm ultimately driving at is, if you have an elder candidate who has been divorced, how do they talk about it? Do you see a soft heart, a heart that grieves what has happened and is open and alive to the love of God? Or do you see someone that's making excuses and saying how it was all her fault? And again, to me, that's more alarming. It's not a question of necessarily what's in your past. It's how do you talk about it? How has God's grace been at work in your life since then? And I think the primary thing I'm looking for is, are you the kind of person who is known in our community for faithfulness to your bride today? Because if you're not, it doesn't mean you'll never be qualified, but I think it means you're not there yet. How do you respond to that? Because I know that's not as clean as just saying yes or no.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that trip people up with a lot of times that things in the Bible are stated in sentences like this, especially when they use a figure of speech, but it's like a command, where it's like, he wants somebody who's faithful, it seems what his intent is, but he uses a figure. I want somebody who's faithful to their wife. And I'm not saying that he's using a figure of speech in a way like he doesn't actually mean that. What I mean is that he's trying to give you an example of what he means and giving you like a practical way of seeing, is this person faithful in their home? Is this person faithful in their marriage? And he'll go into the home later in chapter 2 where he talks about they need to be taking care of their home, because how can they take care of the church if they can't take care of their home? There's those sorts of things are all throughout. Because the way he seems to process through the Old Testament is to say there's a principle that we're driving at here. And so when in chapter 5 he goes on and says, don't muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain, we can look at that and say, well, if I ever get an oxen, if he's ever treading on grain, I need to make sure he's not being muzzled. And it's
not a verse relevant to me today.
You get what I'm saying? But he's like, no, therefore, what you need to do is pay your pastors and elders. And
which is relevant to me today. I believe in that verse.
And so the way Paul approaches things really is not, well, the rule technically says this. It's like, we're trying to communicate a truth to you.
Yes.
And that truth is that this person needs to be faithful in their marriage if they're going to be leading our churches. And so they're going to be faithful in their ministry to the people of the church, because they've demonstrated that in one of the, it's like a furnace, like marriage is this furnace where it's like it's going to show, or crucible, I think is the right way to say it, where it's going to show the type of person that is truly there. Because when you're in such close proximity to another sinner on a daily basis, who you really are really shows.
Well, and I've been doing this long enough to know Satan's oldest playbook is to try to tempt a pastor, leader sexually. Like I have had people I care about, known, walked with in ministry and seen them fall. And I think one of the reasons this is top of the list is Satan's going to go for it. So you better shore this up by the grace of God. And what I love about what you're saying is that Paul's not establishing like a rigid yes-no rule that you don't even have to think about your heart. He's getting to the heart posture of the man, which is everything we've been saying Jesus is doing in the Sermon on the Mount for how many weeks now? Since you preached on anger, and then it's been a few weeks more. And we'll see it again this Sunday. So to try to give a clear answer, because I know this can almost sound like, let me be very clear. Question asker, is it disqualifying to have a divorce if you want to be an elder? I would say no. And I would follow that up just by repeating, we're not lowering the bar of what Scripture says. I actually think we're reading it in context well, and we're actually raising the bar. Because again, we don't just want to have guys that have never technically been divorced. We want to have guys in leadership whose hearts are totally devoted to their wives. And again, even as I say that, I'm like, it's going to be imperfect. Like, we're going to fail as we do it. But are we on a trajectory where we would say we're growing and we're all in? That's the kind of thing we're looking for. And I think that's a lot harder than saying, how many times have you been married?
And I think this goes into the conversation around divorce as well as a whole, because if the question is not like, well, technically, when's the moment I can get divorced? It's like, no, the goal should be to have a healthy, fruitful marriage.
Yep.
And that's what we're striving toward. And are there places that you may have failed in the past, you may have dropped the ball, you may have done this, that, or the other. It's like, we're not looking for excuses out. We're aiming at being like Christ.
Yep.
And I think in the divorce passage, that's what you were getting at as well when you were preaching on Sunday. It's really more about, are you going to be someone who works at this, or are you just going to look for the way out? It's same thing with a murder. Well, I technically didn't murder him. It's like, but but the way you're treating him, or
I like how you also said, are you moving this way or that way? Because a couple of times when I've said, we want guys whose hearts are totally devoted to their wife, I'm thinking, gosh, I have room to grow. It's a question of, are you moving in that direction, and are you known for that direction? That's the kind of thing, because we want to be able to say to our leaders, follow me as I follow Christ. And so we're talking trajectory and direction. We're not talking perfection. Let me wrap with this, and then I want to see if you have any other things come to your mind. If you are hearing this and you're going, I bet you they're equivocating because they're trying to get someone through that's been divorced. Let me just very clearly say, on our current crop of elder candidates who we're going to be announcing late spring, early summer, I'm really looking forward to getting to that point. No one in that current crop has ever been divorced. So we don't have a biased reason to land here. This is my best understanding of studying the Scriptures. Studied this with the elder candidates. This is our best understanding, and hopefully we've communicated some of that understanding and that heart to you today. Again, we're trying to have a high bar for leadership because it's a weighty, weighty thing to look to Jesus to lead the church. And so I just wanted to address that. I don't know. I guess I'm skeptical by nature, and I would want to know, are they biased? And nope, there's no bias other than wanting to interpret God's word well and rightly handle the word of truth. So that said, anything not from this question that fired up for you in the sermon, or did I just answer it all?
I mean, I wonder if we can further tease out that verse 32 that says, but I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Especially in relation to its connection to Deuteronomy, I think they're all very tightly wound together here. And I often hear people looking at that exception with the, well, if that happens, then, how do we approach that faithfully to how this text is presenting it, and how it relates to Deuteronomy 24, I guess would be my question.
Well, are you asking about the makes her commit adultery language?
Well, yeah, and that's to me would be where I would go first, is like, it makes her commit adultery is except on the grounds of sexual immorality. How does that clause modify?
So I think he's saying in Jesus' day, and certainly when Deuteronomy 24 was written, although largely in Jesus' day still, I said on Sunday, the unfortunate reality is that women did not share equal rights to men in the society at large at that point. And so the baseline assumption was if your husband left you, you would go and hopefully find someone else that would love you and care for you, because you couldn't, again, in that culture, you couldn't really do this on your own. And so I think Jesus' baseline assumption is if a husband leaves his wife, she's going to have to go find someone that will care for her. So when he says you're making her commit adultery, I think what he's saying is if you get divorced and break the covenant, and then she has to go marry someone else to be able to make her way through the world in this culture, you've now made her an adulterer because God joined you together. And again, I don't think Jesus is putting weight on the woman. I know how we could hear it that way as modern people. I think he's putting weight on the men and say, do not put your bride in that position because God's coming for you. I think he's exhibiting compassion towards the woman and pressure on the men. And certainly, if you read Deuteronomy 24 in context, I gave us one verse on Sunday. Deuteronomy 24 goes on to say, and hey, if you give her that certificate of divorce and she goes and marries someone else and he also divorces her, you can't take her back as your wife, for that would, let's look it up. I think it uses the language of defilement. And again, as modern Westerners, we hear that and we're like, why is God saying that women are defiled? And he's not saying that women are the one doing the defiling. He's saying actually the men are. So let me just see if I can get it here.
I think it really gets at that idea of if you're just ready to break apart the relationship over any indiscretion, then it's like, well, you're just treating her cheaply. And if it's like, oh, you can leave, oh, I'll take you back. It's like she's not just an object to be thrown around back and forth. It's like, no, she's a human being who's God's image, who needs to be loved and cared for.
So Deuteronomy 24:4 says, then her former husband, this is if she gets divorced the second time, right? Then the first husband who sent her away, he may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that would be an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring this sin upon the land, right? I think what he's saying is if you toss God's daughters around like a bad country song, like you just want her back because you're lonely tonight. That's the kind of thing God says that defiles my land, and it tells lies about what I'm like, that you want someone 1 second and then you don't want them, and then you're hot, you're cold, you're yes and you're no. What song is that? You're hot and you're cold, you're yes and you know.
I think that's Katy Perry.
Okay, so what God's saying is when you're doing that, that defiles the land, because you're supposed to be showing an image that God is faithful. He's not hot and cold. He's always white hot in his love for us. And so to go back to the Matthew passage when it says he makes her commit adultery, I think what he's saying is remember what God has joined together, don't let any human separate. And so if you push her out of your home, God joined you together, but because of the reality of society back then, she would probably have to go get married to someone else. So she gets married to someone else and now is joined to him. She is now separated from what God joined together. But again, I would say the weight that's being pressed there is on the man. Don't make her go and do this. Be faithful to the bride of your youth is, I think, the primary encouragement there. So let me say this. I have walked with people who hear those words and they're just filled with grief. Like, have I made my ex an adulterer? Is this like an unforgivable state? And that's why I tried to say 100 times on Sunday, hey, God's grace is big. He covers our past. And so I don't think this is meant to make us live in just like, oh my gosh, I've made someone an adulterer and it can never be undone. Now, let me not take away from any conviction the Holy Spirit would bring. Maybe you hear this message and you're hearing this and you're like, I need to go back to my ex and apologize for what I did. I don't want to take away from you. God might lead you to do that. I just want to say, it's not saying that you're stuck forever in that place. If God leads you to go and apologize, by all means do that. But in the grace of God, get back up and say, I can have a new future, I guess would be what I would want to add to that. So,
yeah, I think as we process through it, what really stands out to me is it almost feels that we are being pressed to care for people at their lowest moments. And it almost will, I'm processing through it. It's like you're making her commit adultery. It's almost like realizing the reality of the situation is people go and do wrong things sometimes because you put them in a bad position, and so they respond by doing badly. And so our disposition needs to be, we're not going to put someone in a bad position first and foremost, but also understanding on the other end, if we see somebody making foolish, bad, whatever type of decisions, even if that's sexual in nature or any other sort of type of sin there is, even if it's a big sin, we need to be able to sit and listen, because sometimes people do that out of fear, out of desperation, out of those sorts of things. And so what God seems to be trying to do here is saying, don't put somebody in a bad position like that where they feel that those are the realistic options for them. And don't create an environment, don't create a world where that's normal. But we live in a society where these sorts of things are normative, and we wonder why people respond the way they do. And it's like, are we creating space to understand and care for people in these hard places?
Yeah, and I think one last thought for me that came up when you were sharing that is the makes her commit adultery language. I think those are the hardest words in some ways in that text. I think adultery is a stand-in there for moving away from God's heart for marriage, right? Because by the technical letter of the law, she's not committing adultery. But I think what he's saying is you're making her move away from God's heart for marriage. God's heart is that you would stay married unless the covenant's been so broken that it's not safe for her, like I talked about on Sunday. But God's heart is that you would stay married, and if you're not in one of those exception clause, is what they're typically called, cases, and you send her away, you are moving her away from God's heart for marriage by removing her husband from her. And in today's egalitarian society, I just want to say this can go both ways now, where it wasn't the power dynamics back then, but it can be that a woman could leave her husband and make him, in Jesus' language, commit adultery by moving him away from God's heart for marriage because she leaves not on the kinds of grounds that God is outlining here. Again, I will always say this when I'm talking about this. We're not asking anyone to go back to an unsafe marriage. We're not talking about anything like that. Jesus' whole accept is there for a reason. But we're talking under normal garden variety, just I'm unhappy situations. When you send your spouse away or when you leave, you're moving them away from God's heart for marriage. So you're not just hurting you, you're hurting your spouse. And I think that is the weight in the makes her commit adultery language.
I love how, and I just took the New City Catechism. I keep going back to catechisms because all the catechisms really spend a lot of time about the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount. They really like to do it. And I love how they always approach these because the New City Catechism says, we abstain from sexual immorality and we live purely and faithfully. That's where the heart is. It's like...
I like the positive there, yeah.
Yeah, it's like our goal is to live a pure and faithful life, not just to abstain from sexual immorality, though we should do that. That's not the only goal here. It's like, are you being pure? Are you being faithful in the way you approach things? And it says whether you're in marriage or in single life. This applies to everybody. We should all live purely and faithfully, and not just sexually, but also sexually. Mm-hmm. So, did you have any other questions? I see other things written down.
Nope, those were just my thoughts I wanted to address on that question. Yeah,
okay.
I know. It looks like a laundry list, but it's just the one. I don't know how long we've been going, but that's our riff on one question. So there's so much more I could share. If you don't have any questions, I just want to end with a brief story that came up at Gospel Community on Sunday night. So one of the questions that came up at our group is, hey, does it actually work? Like, if what you're saying is God's heart is that marriage wouldn't end, and even in cases where covenant partners have been unfaithful, if it's a position where nobody's like well-being is like in danger, the contour of the gospel, as I articulated on Sunday, would be to fill in the gaps where sin abounds. And so someone basically asked kind of in a casual way, like, does that actually work? And I just want to share this because I didn't in the sermon on Sunday. I was serving my first pastoral job as an associate pastor, and there was a devastating case of an affair between one leader in the church and the wife of another leader in the church. Like the worst case you could ever conceive of. And I was there when the husband whose wife had been unfaithful was just processing in grief and anger. And I feel deeply what that does to a person. And I don't want to put too clean of a bow on it. It was difficult and messy. Over time, that man whose wife had been unfaithful came to the conclusion, Jesus was faithful to me when I was not faithful to him. So how could I not be faithful to my bride, even in light of this? And it was a process. It was messy. But by God's grace, they found healing and restoration in their marriage and are better off on this side of it than before. Now, I don't want to promise easy answers and easy solutions to anybody. I just want to say, don't let anyone ever tell you that a marriage is too far gone, that God's grace cannot heal. I've also been involved in marriages where there were abuse dynamics, some of that more emotional, and it was like, hey, for God's grace to come in and heal, we need to get some space first.
You've seen some from the outside?
Yes. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying. But I've seen that in pastoral roles. So I'm not saying that we just flippantly throw anyone back in there. And I think sometimes people well-intentioned could do that. Sometimes space is needed. But what I'm saying is the love of God flowing through the Spirit of God in a person that is receiving that love can resurrect things that look dead. And so whether you're in the case like my friend that I described where his marriage blew up in his face, or whether you're just in a real dry season and you're like, I don't know if there could ever be passion here again, I promise you the love of God is powerful enough to restart the engine of that marriage. And I think that's where I would want to leave it is the love of God is powerful, and when it gets in you, it brings resurrecting power. And so don't give up on this vision. And if we can be of help in any practical way, please reach out to us. We are here for you. We love you. We know this stuff isn't easy. That's all I got. You got anything?
I'm good.
All right. Thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time we do. We'll see you Sunday.